Already in turmoil, Libya struggles to avoid even more violence after the Supreme Court orders the internationally recognised parliament to be dissolved. So now what? Can Libyans avoid a power struggle that threatens to kill more people, or will the chaos merely deepen? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now on Thursday, the Supreme Court in Libya ruled that the elected parliament that's been exiled to Tobruk is unconstitutional. Now the rival parliament in Tripoli, that was left in place. Now, since 2011, when Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, Libya has become a battleground. Some say a regional proxy war is being played out between Tripoli in the west and Tobruk in the east. Now, the court ruling only threatens to divide the country still further. And adding to that uncertainty, are regional powers that back opposing sides, fueling the fighting with their military support. So to help set up our show, Mike Hanna has this report.
Libya has been under the control of two rival governments based in separate cities. Now the Supreme Court in the capital Tripoli has given its view of how to move forward. It's declared the Tobruk-based parliament that was elected in June as unconstitutional and has ruled that it should be dissolved. The ruling immediately welcomed by members of the rival leadership group in Tripoli.
Following today's ruling, we resumed our proceedings this morning. We are now waiting for the Constituent Committee that promised to present the first draft of the Constitution on December 24th. This is what all the Libyans are waiting for, to see their future built around a constitution.
In August, armed groups opposed to the government of Prime Minister Abdullah Al-Thani took over the capital Tripoli. They put their own government in place, led by Omar al-Hassi. Prime Minister Al-Thani and his supporters moved eastwards and re-established their government in Tobruk. This further divided a country that had never really been united, with armed militia groups forming in support of two centres of government, one backing the leaders in Tripoli, regarded as more religiously conservative, the other supporting the government in Tobruk, seen as more moderate. This all adding to a situation that has grown increasingly chaotic since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, with rival brigades rejecting consecutive governments that appeared powerless to restore any semblance of law and order on a national basis. One of the most powerful, led by former General Khalifa Haftar, claimed control over the eastern city of Benghazi and areas around it, rejecting the General National Congress in Tripoli, but also not formally supporting the government in Tobruk. And the UN support mission in Libya is not taking sides, saying only that it has taken note of the Supreme Court decision.
The mission reiterated its commitment to Libya's sovereignty and independence, as well as its territorial integrity, adding that the UN underscored the need for all to act responsibly and not to take actions that would escalate the existing polarization or lead to a further deterioration of the security situation.
But those rejecting the Supreme Court decision make clear that the decision itself is just one more polarizing factor. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera.
So let's have a look now at some of the important events that have taken place and brought us to this point. Now, in June, voter turnout was low in elections for a new parliament and a prime minister. Abdullah Al-Thani, he was appointed. Now, still, the international community officially recognised these results, but heavy fighting then broke out as politicians with slightly more Islamic agendas, along with their militias, challenged these election results. Now, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, they reportedly back the elected government with military support, whilst Qatar and Turkey are said to have thrown their weight behind rival armed groups. After intense fighting, the capital, Tripoli, eventually fell to a group of militias calling themselves Libyan Dawn. They are aligned with the Islamic faction. Well, meanwhile, the elected parliament with its prime minister is forced to move to the eastern city of Tobruk, whilst the capital remains under militia control. Then, on Thursday, as we've seen, a legal challenge by a group of politicians led to the Supreme Court ruling that the Tobruk Parliament was unconstitutional and should be dissolved. With us now to discuss this and more, I'm joined from London by Anas El-Gomati, who's political analyst and director of the Tripoli-based Sadek Institute. From Washington, D.C., Manal Omar. She's an associate vice president with the Centre for Middle East and North Africa with the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's also a former international advisor for the National Libya Stabilisation Team in Benghazi. And finally, joining us on Skype from Dubai is Ali Kereri, a political analyst. He's a former senior advisor with the U.S. Central Command Department. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on Inside Story. But can I start with you first, Anas. Anas, as a Libyan, how would you define this moment now for your country?
I would define it as a lose-lose situation. I think it's incredibly dire. I think in any way in which a divided population, a polarised population arrives at a legal decision by the highest court in the land and looks at it as a win or lose situation, then effectively it's going to be a political loss for all those concerned. So I suppose in one respect, the first loss is that if the House of Representatives decides not to accept the decision by the Supreme Court, then in fact it's a massive, massive loss to the foundation and pillar of building a democratic state. It's the rule of law and the principle of justice. And so that any kind of knocking and shaking against that kind of pillar is going to be devastating to Libya's kind of fledgling chances at building a democratic state. And conversely, by accepting the decision, and if the HOR is effectively dissolved, then what kind of electoral or democratic currency is left in the country? Effectively, all sides now feel less empowered, politically speaking, and the militias now feel much more emboldened. And so in that respect, it's dire prospects all around.
Before I come to you, Manal, and to you, Ali, let's just hear from Omar al-Hassi, who is the Tripoli-based so-called Salvation Government leader. This is what he had to say.
I call upon the UN envoy to read the Libyan situation again and tell him if he fails to understand the situation here, we are more than happy to help him see the real picture. We don't want him to lose his status of neutrality in his work. Libya is now in need of those who can bring all parties in the conflict together. The most important thing right now is dialogue and national reconciliation between all Libyans.
Manal, let me start with you now in Washington, D.C. He's calling for reconciliation and dialogue. Do you think that's likely right now?
I think that it's going to be hard to achieve, but I think it's the essential step. Just as there is no real military or armed solution to Libya, they can continue to fight for a long time and not arrive at a conclusion. It's also not going to be solved through just a simple elections void of a national dialogue and a real political solution that's agreed on. I think that's been the primary challenge of Libya, is that they continue to have elections or to have particular landmarks without an agreed upon overall framework. And I think I worry about the release of the constitution draft, because in many ways that has also been done in parallel and in isolation of a larger dialogue and reconciliation discussion that is essential for Libya to be successful.
And Ali, can I come to you in Dubai? As ever in the region, when there's turmoil, there are people, countries, state players and non-state players indeed, who are watching particularly closely with a great deal of wariness. In the case of Libya, who might they be and why?
Well, of course, the tragedy of the NATO intervention in Libya was they moved very quickly to remove Gaddafi without thinking the day after, as President Obama indeed admitted recently in an interview with Tom Friedman in the New York Times. As a result of the vacuum that was created post-Gaddafi, obviously regional powers have interests that they need to defend. In Egypt's case, for example, it's an immediate neighbor of Libya's, and the Egyptians have their own problems with jihadis, and they're obviously very concerned about the rise of the militias and al-Qaeda-affiliated groups that have taken power across Libya. They have surface-to-air missiles, they have small and medium and even heavy equipment. They're obviously involved in oil smuggling. Also, the Gulf countries Qatar, for example, and Turkey are backing Islamist forces in Libya, where more moderate Western allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are obviously very concerned about the rise of political Islam and are thus intervening to try to prevent Islamist militias from taking power in Libya. So it's a very messy situation. It's likely to be protracted and bloody and costly for all involved, including the international community.
And Manal, so it sounds as though there's a real toxic mix of regional meddling in Libya. Add to that the fundamental debate as to how far secularism should be pursued or a political system that includes religion.
I think that's how the debate has been discussed. I think that's how the debate has been formed in some ways, which unfortunately has led to polarization. But I would like to challenge the basic premise to really highlight what's happening in Libya is because there is no real government. People talk about a failed state, but there's no state to really fail. What you're seeing is a default return to the only institutions that survived post-Gaddafi, which is either the deep state or the religious actors. I don't think, particularly in the case of Libya, that it is really about secular and Islamic. What you're seeing emerge is a level of extremism. You're seeing emerge people who are unhappy with the formed government and the system and then trying to find ways to counter that. Unfortunately, the only solution that's coming out is a political Islam, as well as a more extreme version of a political Islam. But I would really challenge that there is a divide in Libya between religious and sector. I think it's more of a question of where political Islam falls because it's one of the only institutions that survived.
And Anas, then how are we likely to see the Tobruk faction, for want of a better description, how are we going to see them behave now as a result of the parliament that was elected, albeit by a tiny minority of the population in June? How are they going to react? What are they going to do? Is there a danger that they'll take up arms as well?
Well, I don't believe that there is a cohesive centre from within the House of Representatives. I think there are many different factions, all with their own motivations and drives to see this play out in a way in which would suit their positions in the East. Some are talking of secession, and I think there are many factors there that one could discuss. I'm not sure how relevant and applicable they are, but it certainly puts Libya down a path of more polarisation. But I think ultimately this notion of whether to arm or disarm, I mean, that is ultimately the only solution that is left. And I think most of the actors now, particularly in the political arena, feel much less empowered. And I think that in that respect, that vacuum opens up much more involvement for the armed factions. If we look at that and we kind of explore the dynamics there, then I think we have to look at this EU roadmap or a UN roadmap or an international community brokered roadmap. And the roadmap has to start at the security sector, and it certainly has to end at the ballot box, but it can't start again at the ballot box. It doesn't seem palatable that anybody wants to go to the ballot box anymore. And I think that in that respect, when we try to understand who are the essential power brokers on the ground, what is it that they want, when we look at this kind of notion of secularism and Islamism has already been discussed, there's definitely a clear gap and disconnection between the leadership and those that speak in this kind of terms and those on the ground. There are definite grievances amongst those that have been persecuted for religious reasons. Those are now being represented by Ansar al-Sharia. You could not find a more polarised mix there. There are certainly people that are worried about terrorism and are worried about being, knocked off or being assassinated, but they're now being, represented by remnants of the former regime and have definitely made that wider than just a simple war on terror against Ansar al-Sharia or against Al-Qaeda, but have included within their democratic parties and potentially any democratic opposition towards them either. So in this case, in this very, very moment now, there is a huge door that's opened. And if that door is opened by the international community and they understand how to calibrate, how to try to use the current disillusionment with electoral policies and electoral processes and try to reconfigure a way in which off-the-table discussions are taking place with real power brokers, there has to be an accommodation for people that we don't particularly like. It could be people from the former regime, remnants of the deep state, but it also has to include certain Islamist actors. I mean, this is the door that is now open, and it could be the opportunity that we've been lacking for the last 3.5 years.
And Ali, in Dubai, in 2011, of course, we saw NATO play a seminal role in the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi and boosting the rebels to take control of Libya. We assume that given that the United States and others are consumed now with the battle against ISIL in both Iraq and in Syria, that there'll be a little appetite to get any more involved in Libya.
I think that's exactly right. And I think I'd like to actually go back to Manal's analysis. I largely agree that this isn't really an issue of secularism versus Islamism. What it is the reality, like in Syria, like in Iraq and in Yemen, Gaddafi's government was largely secular, and thus the opposition groups were largely Islamist. What's happened is because Gaddafi was the state himself, when he went away, there was nothing to fill that vacuum other than some very radicalist jihadi groups. And so what's emerging now is given the lack of sort of identity or given the lack of institutions in the state, people are falling back on their religious identity or their tribal identity. And that's why you're seeing the situation in Libya become so dangerous, because essentially the country is being at risk of being shattered across its historic internal boundaries, not as the international boundaries that have been recognized now for decades. And that's why this has become a regional proxy war, and it's become so dangerous and volatile and unstable and unpredictable and costly.
Can I just get you a little bit more on that particular issue? Because I'd like to know a little bit more about those regional players who are so involved in the situation in Libya. The United States, for instance, accusing both the UAE and Egypt of being responsible for airstrikes on Tripoli as the Libyan Dawn was preparing to take the city.
I think Washington's accusations aside, given the fact that no clear information or evidence has been presented, the reality is that all of the actors in the region have a stake in what's happening in Libya. If for no other reason, then they need to stem the tide of transnational jihad. We've seen clearly in Iraq and in Syria what happens when failed states leave vacuums. What happens, unfortunately, is some of the more organized and powerful forces right now in the Muslim world happen to be Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, or even more virulent actors like ISIS. So what is critical for these Gulf countries and for Egypt, for example, is they want to stem the tide and the rise of these groups before it's too late, before they take hold and before they essentially control the entire state. I think that perhaps they may have actually moved too slowly. And the bizarre thing about Washington's accusations is, for years now, President Obama has told our allies around the world that the United States is basically stepping back, leading from behind, pivoting to Asia, et cetera, and that they need to handle their own affairs. Well, let's assume that Washington's accusations are correct, that Libya and that Egypt and the UAE did in fact intervene militarily, and that Qatar and Turkey and others may have done the same. They're doing exactly what President Obama asked them to do, which is handle matters in their own, as they see fit. Now that they've done so, they're moving to defend their interests. Washington is upset. The reality, of course, is that neither extreme is viable. What needs to happen here is a political settlement, a disarmament of the militias. But for very complicated reasons on the ground, actors are not willing to give up their arms in very volatile situations like this. And so given the world's distraction with ISIS and Russia and other matters, what's likely to happen is this problem will fester and continue for some time to come, for the foreseeable future, unfortunately.
Manal, in Washington, I mean, the problem does seem to be that the genie's been let out of the bottle following the strong suppression and control of the Gaddafi regime. Multiple ethnicities, religious groups, tribal groups and political factions have now emerged, each with a fairly narrowly defined self-interest, and they're all competing, and of course weapons are involved.
I think that's correct. I mean, one thing that I would just point out is I think when President Obama was hoping that the solutions would come from the region, it was more in terms of the Arab League or through the UN versus these type of bilateral interventions that are also often done informally and tend to not really be done in consultation with those in state. And I think that does raise solid issues of questions on sovereignty. In terms of what you described, you know, one of the primary things I've been reiterating, whether it's the case of Libya or the case of Yemen or more positive cases like Tunisia is that when you have these type of transitions, particularly one that went through the violence that Libya went through, it is natural for people to go to the default. You've taken out the state, you've taken out rule of law. There is a natural re-emergence of tribal, religious, other identities. I have absolutely no doubt that if we were to take out the systems and the institutions in the U.S., that we would see the exact same type of diversity and identity problems that would emerge. What Libya is going through is particularly common in transitions. I think what has happened is that the international community has put artificial timelines and forced Libya to move very quickly, where they had to skip a lot of the process involved in constitution building, in national dialogue, and in reconciliation, which has resulted in the emergence and I would say maybe the over-empowerment of militias. What I hope to see is that the UN is probably the best body to step in and to help really support the Libyan initiatives. There are several initiatives on the ground to convene the different political parties. As I said earlier, I don't think a military solution, whether it's internal or regional or international, is the solution. And I also think that these independent landmarks of elections or constitution without a larger framework will only lead to several decades possibly of Libya going through a reiteration of what we're seeing now. I hope that can be avoided through proper convening and national dialogue process.
And going back to you, Anas, in London, Ali earlier made reference to historical Libya, the Libya of three separate entities. Is it helpful to consider the eastern part of Libya as a separate entity, the western part as a separate entity, and indeed the south?
To what end, I suppose, is the real question. But I think, these are just iterations of different ideas that have historically been there. But everything is an idea. Even Libya, Libya is an idea ultimately, and it starts somewhere near Tobruk and it ends somewhere near Jazeera and towards the south as well. So I suppose in that respect, any iteration of what it means is almost irrelevant to the facts on the ground, which are 80% of the political party representation in the GNC was from regional parties. They weren't Islamist or secular. They were regional parties. And the reason for that is people feel like there is an elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is there's this huge lottery called the national budget. 50 to 65 billion every year that comes out of this budget is going to go down and filter through into the ground. Is going to make some people feel very rich and some people feel very poor. And a lot of these regions don't want to feel very poor, so we can frame this in any kind of way we want to, Cyrenaica, Fezzan, Tripolitania, if we really want to. But ultimately it comes down to the various kind of power plays. And as we've already heard earlier on, yes, there is a huge vacuum there that Gaddafi's left behind. But I think ultimately, we can recalibrate this. If we try to find the proper solutions, if we try to find an equitable way of accommodating all these different actors, then we could. And I suppose I agree with Manal, a military solution looks like the least appetizing and least palatable one to the international community. But from people that I've spoken to from within Libya Dawn and from within Operation Dignity, they've all said that we've got the firepower here to keep this going until 2020. So at least in their minds, they want to carry this. They want to carry this on. They don't see any other settlement other than a military settlement right now. And it's the international community's job to try to provide much more venues, much more doors, and open up avenues for accommodating these different actors and saying, well, hey, there's a political situation here. We can actually resolve it politically speaking, and we can keep your institutions that are there, because the Supreme Court was there and it still acted, and it acted with Ahmed Matig 4 months ago, 5 months ago. It was there, and we cannot lose that. I mean, if once we've lost the rule of law, what is there to build upon in terms of foundations? And I suppose the real question, obviously, when it comes to political settlements is everybody wants to speak to their own factions. I think, Bernardino's position now is to try to get everyone there. The real adage here is that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And that is the question that Libyans have to address today. Who do you want to make peace with? Do you want to make peace with the former regime? Because that's the only way that you're going to have a settlement. Does the former regime want to make peace with the people that they put in prison for the last 40 years? Well, they're going to have to do so. And I think, any fear that I have of a secular Islamist debate is now completely off the table. These are about armed factions that are there to fight for probably less boring or much more boring factors than just Islamism and religion and the greater identity of Libya. There are grievances there that people have, but the leadership, make no mistake about it, the leadership are there for financial and military objectives in the same way that Gaddafi was there for financial and military objectives. He wasn't here to rehash socialism out, and he wasn't here to be a cheap man's Marx. He was there for the financial and military objectives. Everybody else is there for the very same reasons, and I think that is the wake-up call that we need to have now. Unfortunately, the biggest crisis that we're going to have is looking at this opportunity and thinking, well, it's more of the same. If we don't wake up, it'll be a tragedy of biblical proportions.
OK, thank you so much, all of you. We have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Anas El-Ghamati in London, Manal Omar in Washington, D.C. and Ali Kedri from Dubai. Thank you all very much indeed for talking to us here on Inside Story. Now, remember that you can add your voice to the discussion. You can get hold of us at our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Also on Twitter, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Martine Dennis. Thank you for watching and see you again soon.